join me in welcoming my colleague, Hella Dale. Hella?
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you very much for our speaker today for being here with us on a day when I think we all feel that talking about the subject of his new book, Realism and Democracy and the Arab Spring and the Middle East, the region in which all this takes place, is highly topical. Elliot Abrams hardly needs an introduction. Currently, he is with the Council on Foreign Relations as a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies, but he has a very distinguished career prior to that within the government, serving as Assistant Secretary for Human Rights under President Reagan and Deputy National Security Advisor under George W. Bush. He also served as president of the Center for Ethics and Public Policy, and he is on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. As President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital is at the top of the news, Elliot Abrams is eminently well placed to sort out the strands of U.S. policy in the Middle East. He is one of the most influential thinkers on American foreign policy, especially on human rights and democracy and realism, the strains of U.S. foreign policy that sometimes come into conflict with each other and create certain amount of tensions. He is a highly prolific author. His most recent book, prior to this one, was Tested by Zion, about the Bush administration's policy in Israel-Palestinian conflicts. And his most recent book, which we have here today and on sale outside, Realism and Democracy, American Foreign Policy After the Arab Spring. Some of obviously the book's key themes are the two tensions, the tension between realism and democracy, between idealism and realism. In the Middle East, we see this played out time and time again, and we do so again today as a new administration is looking for its own path towards Middle East peace. I am so much looking forward to his talk today, and we'll let him speak for as long as he feels comfortable, maybe 20 minutes or so, and hope that everybody will have lots of questions.
Good, thank you. Thanks, Helen.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, because we are being webcast, right?
Yes, yeah.
I have no comment, so we can go right to the questions. In the Q&A period, I'd be happy to talk about matters that don't directly relate to the content of the book, Jerusalem, Iran, the nuclear deal, all of that. But let me talk for a few minutes about the book itself. What's the issue here? Everybody, okay. Americans always favor democracy. I mean, we think that's the best form of government. We are for human rights. We think that governments should not be abusive. So what's the problem? Well, we're familiar with this problem that's known as the security dilemma from the Cold War. During the Cold War, we had close relations with a lot of governments that were actually dictatorships. There's a famous story about Franklin D. Roosevelt and somebody saying to him about the dictator of Nicaragua, Anastasio Somoza, the first one, he's a son of a bitch. And Roosevelt replied, yes, but he's our son of a bitch. In other words, for the Cold War period, these were people who were on our side against the communists, against the Soviet Union. And the theory was, what's going to happen if these people are overthrown? You're not going to get a Jeffersonian democracy. You're going to get a worse government or an equally bad government, and it won't be on our side. It will be on the Soviet side. So there were a lot of cases where we supported such governments. Now, President Reagan had a more sophisticated view of this. That is that sometimes the repressive governments in place were actually dangerous to us and likely to result in a communist takeover. Why did he, after all, tell President Marcos in the Philippines, it's time to go. Why did he say the same thing, in essence, to President Pinochet in Chile? I can go down the list. There are others. President Chun Doo-hwan in South Korea, because Reagan thought this kind of a dictatorship, which may have been necessary one day, will ultimately redound to the benefit of the communist side. It will allow them to gather more support, and we need to avoid that. Now, I have to say I've had a, 30-year argument with Henry Kissinger about Pinochet in Chile, because his view was, how many times do you have to learn this lesson? In 1979, we see the Shah overthrown in Iran. Did it get better or worse? It got worse. It got more repressive and anti-American. How about Nicaragua? Somoza, 1979. Did it get better or worse? More repressive and anti-American. My answer to that was, right, that's right. Of course, that's Jimmy Carter in both cases. The lesson I think we learn is you don't want a situation of absolute chaos. You don't want the security forces to collapse as they did in Nicaragua and Iran in 1979, and Russia in 1917, another good example, and Cuba in 1959, another good example. But there is such a thing as a reasonable transition to democracy. And Reagan knew how to do it, and he did it. Chile has been a democracy from the 1980s, after Pinochet, without a break. So has South Korea. The Philippines, more or less, I think I'd say. So the security dilemma teaches you to pay attention and be careful and avoid chaos where the worst forces can step in, but it certainly doesn't teach you, democracy and human rights is the enemy. Okay, fast forward to now, the Arab Spring. What's the security dilemma? The security dilemma is, if you open the political system to the possibility of democracy, free elections, free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, you know what you're going to get? You're going to get the Muslim Brotherhood. You're going to get jihadis winning. That's today's security dilemma in the Middle East. And that is the argument that people make in saying, forget about this democracy and human rights stuff in the Middle East. It's impossible. Now, some of the people saying that are, of course, dictators. I mean, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt ruled for 30 years. In those 30 years, he did not, in fact, eliminate the Muslim Brotherhood, partly because the Muslim Brotherhood was a very useful thing for him, because he could say to us, to the Americans, it's me or the Brotherhood, it's me or the Brotherhood. When he fell, Tahrir Square, where were the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt? They were in Egypt. He hadn't exiled them. Most of them were not in prison. They were at their places of business, or they were at home. So he didn't even really try to crush the Muslim Brotherhood. What he tried to crush was the center, because he saw the center moderate groups, including moderate Muslim groups, as a real threat, the real threat to him. And I think that's a pattern you see in the Middle East. The dictator falls. There's an uprising. Tunisia, Egypt. And again, this is a pattern we saw in everything from the Bolshevik Revolution on. Who is prepared to take power? Very often, the most conspiratorial, the most secretive, and worst groups. Why? Because the dictators have crushed the center deliberately. Now, something that happens in these places, they win, the bad guys, if you will, the Muslim extremists win the first election. I mean, it happened in Egypt. Muslim Brotherhood won the first election. It happened in Tunisia. But let's not exaggerate their support. In Egypt, somebody who'd been a general and a minister under Mubarak and was in certainly the worst possible candidate, as a relic of the old regime, ran against Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate. Morsi won, but he won 51-49. There's no great landslide for the Muslim Brotherhood. In Tunisia, the Ennahda party, the Muslim Brotherhood-linked party, won with a plurality, not a majority. And in both cases, what happened? They very soon lost their support. And we've seen that in Islamic nations in Asia as well. Why do they lose their support? Because they don't know what to do. They don't know how to govern. They have slogans, but they don't know how to govern. The slogan is, Islam is the answer. Well, it isn't. You're now president. You're now, minister of the economy. You got to create jobs. You're supposed to be building housing. What you've been preaching does not tell you how to do that. Moreover, in those years in which you were in opposition, maybe in exile, you get a kind of halo, right? Those people, the Islamists, they're not corrupt. Of course they're not corrupt. Why would you want to offer one of them a bribe? What can they do for you? There's no temptation. What happens when they get into the government? Temptation appears, corruption appears, also incompetence appears. This is what happened in Tunisia. Ennahda wins the first time around and progressively begins to lose support. After a year in power, if you were not in Egypt, if you were not in the Muslim Brotherhood, if you were not a brother, you were not from Morsi, because they had proved they did not know how to govern, and they were attempting, of course, to take over the entire state and probably make sure that there would never be another free election. So the first election is a real problem. Now, the solution to that problem is not to say, okay, we'll never see elections, never, forget it. The solution to the problem is a longer program allowing more moderate forces to compete with the Islamists. I remember when I was in the Bush White House in 2003, I think it was, a leading human rights activist from Egypt came to see me, and she said, you probably think that I'm going to demand free elections now. And she said, no, I don't want free elections now. We're not ready. I want free elections in 10 years. If you allow me a little political freedom for 10 years so that I get ready and can really, present the ideas to the people of Egypt, which they never got, which Mubarak never permitted. So then when he falls, who's ready? Now, there are some things we ought to be doing, and the last part of the book talks about what is the United States doing in the Middle East to promote democracy, and how can we do it better? And I'll just take a minute on that. There are a number of things we can do, I think. One thing is we're very keen now on civil society and NGOs, supporting civil society and NGOs. And here we are in an NGO, so I want to be careful what I say, but I don't think that's really the right way to go about it. And there's a story I tell in the book about Nelson Mandela. He's president of South Africa, and there's a military dictatorship in Nigeria, and the NGOs in Nigeria want an oil boycott against the government, against the generals. And of course, they go see Mandela in South Africa, and they assume he'll support them, and he says, no. Nope, not going to do it. They're all very shocked, and he says, I'll tell you why. What would happen if the government fell? You people aren't ready for anything. You're not ready to govern, just a bunch of NGOs. We, in the African National Congress, he said, our goal was to seize power, to win power, to govern. You're not ready to govern. I think that we tend too much to support, just, if you will, human rights NGOs or environmental NGOs or women's rights NGOs or, all this stuff. These are all good causes, but they don't prepare people to actually govern the country. Because in governing these countries, that's politics we're talking about. It's persuading people, my views are better for governing the country than that person's views. And that's going to be a very important debate. So let me just say, we should be thinking more about political parties and politics rather than just civil society organizations and NGOs, which, by the way, very often have a lot more support in London or Washington or New York than they do at home, particularly outside the capital city. You know, Mubarak used to say to us, these NGO people that you like, they never leave Cairo. And he was kind of right. They did leave Cairo, but to come here, not to go out in the countryside. We tend to, in our own programs, to use Beltway bandits too much. This is another suggestion I make in the book. That is, AID has a big budget for promoting democracy and human rights, but how do they do it? You know, you hire some firm, by the way, whose personnel and owners consist of former AID career people. So they go out, now they can cash in, and we hire them. And there are a number, I mean, it's in some cases slightly corrupt, but there's another problem which I call tameness. That is, you're in this for the money now, right? You've got your for-profit company, and you want to do contracts with AID to go out to choose your country and do programming. If you challenge the government too much, they're going to kick you out of the country. You're going to lose your contract. There goes your Mercedes. So you want to be very careful not to challenge too much, where it might be in the interest of the United States that you actually challenge more. So I would like to see a little bit less of this contracting with for-profit companies. I don't want to talk too much. I just want to make one final point. Every Muslim country is going to have a debate, is having a debate, has to have a debate about how to govern. And the debate, you know, for them is really what is justice? What does God want? What kind of political system is consistent with the Quran? Consistent with their religion? That's the debate that all Muslim countries are going to have. And it's a real debate, and it's an important debate. And some of the people in that debate, of course, have ideas we consider to be terrible, Islamist extremists, violent or nonviolent. They have ideas. Policemen cannot defeat them in a debate. Policemen or soldiers, on behalf of the regime, can knock them over the head and put them in jail. That doesn't win the debate. We saw this in Turkey a few times over the past 10 or 20 years, where you had an Islamist party, it won the election, the army said no, and either did a coup and or disbanded the party. So what happens? You know, you have the Justice and Welfare Party, it wins an election. The army says, illegal party. So you reform the party a year later. No, it's not the Justice and Welfare Party, it's the Welfare and Justice Party. And it wins the next election. And then it wins the next election. What the reason for this is the army is simply saying, get out. But it doesn't have any ideas. And what's needed is actually better ideas to defeat the Islamists, because they do have ideas. They have ideas that we consider anathema. Somebody, more moderate Muslims, has to come forward, and this has happened, for example, in Tunisia. It's happened in many cases in Muslim countries in Asia, in Indonesia, for example. Somebody has to come forward and say, this is a Muslim heresy. We have better ideas. Policemen can't win that debate. So from the, why I put the word realism there, realism point of view, from the realpolitik point of view, we want to defeat the Islamist extremists. They are not going to be defeated merely by jail, merely by police. They're going to be defeated in those countries when there can be a debate and the people of those countries can be persuaded, those are terrible ideas. Don't vote for that guy. In the long run then, and I would say the medium run, not even the long run, we should be in favor of permitting those debates, because it's the only way those ideas will actually be defeated in Muslim countries. Okay, I don't want to go on too long. It gets boring I could go on for hours, but it'd be boring for you. So again, I'm very happy to talk about this, but also happy to talk about other questions related to American policy in the Middle East.
Thank you very much. Do you want to call in the questions?
Sure.
So,
Okay, sir.
And I think, do we have a microphone? Do we have a microphone?
Someplace.
It'll come with mic.
Never let it be said that there was no microphone in the Heritage Foundation.
It's coming. Well, why don't you ask your question?
Go ahead. And,
Please introduce yourself.
I've been talking too much. That's the actual answer.
With the recent events in Saudi Arabia, the change in leadership there.
I'm sorry, could you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry, David Smith from Dallas, Texas. With your recent comments about the need to change, have the dialogue in Muslim countries, how do you relate that with the change in leadership in Saudi Arabia? You know, is that just a generational change, or is that dialogue beginning?
Good question, very interesting question. You know, I think, let me start with using a word I use in the book, legitimacy. Governments need to be legitimate. That is, the people of the country need to view the government in place as rightfully there. Now, we believe the best way to do this is democracy, elections. But there are other ways. One way is monarchy, legitimate monarchy, of which there are a number in the Arab world. Another way is good performance. When Lee Kuan Yew was Prime Minister of Singapore, really wasn't democratic, but the effectiveness, the efficiency of the government was fantastic, and people knew it. And you see this in polls today, and you see it, for example, of the UAE, people of that country thinking, we have an awfully good government. In Saudi Arabia, there is a legitimate monarchy, and because of oil prices of $120 a barrel, the government had plenty of money to spread around to make the people think, well, this is a pretty good government. Oil has fallen by half, and so the economic model they had, which is nobody really has to work, we just have all this oil, it's over. So I think what particularly the Crown Prince is doing is looking around and saying, our world has changed. And without all that money, we're going to face a problem. They have a real population. You know, the Emirates and Qatar basically don't have any, you know, they have a few 100,000 people. Saudi Arabia, there are 30 million people living there. How are we going to perform? Because if we don't perform, if the economy just collapses, our legitimacy in the royal family is going to collapse as well. So he's starting to think about that. And I think the Saudi 2030 plan is really quite a terrific plan. He's thinking the right way. It's a very young population. If I remember right, the median age is 27. And it's a fast-growing population. So people need to work. We in the government need to provide jobs, and we need to provide things for people to do. For example, entertainment. Novel, in fact, groundbreaking, path-breaking, amazing new things like movie theaters. There aren't any movie theaters. So they're starting that. Amusement parks. He's thinking about a different Saudi Arabia. And he's thinking about it because he looks around the world. He does not see oil prices climbing up again. So it has to be different. And from his point of view, the form of governance has to be different too. That is, their form of governance was brother to brother to brother. It's a very strange monarchy. I don't think there's any other example. Not father to son, brother, 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 brother. And happily for them, there were a lot of brothers. But of course, with each change, the brother who was getting to be king was older. So at one point, you're talking about people who were 60. Now you're talking about people who are getting on to 90. That had to change too. And so he is the first person from the next generation. He is not a son of the founder, Ibn Saud. He's a grandson, first one. So I think these changes are necessary. I think we as Americans should really be hoping and cheering that they work, because it's a very important country for us, politically and economically. It's a huge challenge to take a population, most of which is not really educated for 21st century work. I mean, one of the other things he seems to be doing is realizing if we're going to make it here in Saudi Arabia, we're going to need women as well as men to be part of this economy. He's taken one step, but I'm confident there will be more steps in that direction. Yes.
Yes, I'm Robert Weiner. I'm a center associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. And I was wondering whether or not you could comment on the policy of the Obama administration towards the Arab Spring, which is a perfect example of realism versus human rights and democracy.
You know, the Obama administration is sort of interesting. They had no policy toward the Arab Spring. There is a view that, you know, Obama threw Mubarak under the bus. You hear that a lot. I don't think that's right. I don't think Obama did anything. That is, Mubarak was running Egypt. He was the president. He was the dictator pretty much. That was fine with Obama. And then he was overthrown. And that was fine with Obama. Then the military ruled. That was fine. Then the Muslim Brotherhood ruled. That was fine. Then the Muslim Brotherhood was overthrown. That was fine. I mean, there was just no policy at all. I think there was, you know, the only policy in the region, besides a general distaste for Israel, which I think was Obama policy, the only policy was the desperation to get the Iran nuclear deal. And everything else had to bow before that. And anything that might have interfered with getting the nuclear deal, for example, the fact that people were being killed in large numbers in Syria, could not actually be discussed. But I think, you know, there's a tendency to think, well, Obama, so he's on the left, he's a Democratic Party, surely he had a big, forceful human rights policy. I would say he had no human rights policy. Certainly was not an issue that he took up with repressive or non-democratic regimes. And, you know, on his watch, really astonishing, horrendous human rights tragedy occurred in Syria. Fred Hoff was a man who was retired Army officer who was Obama's special representative for Syria. And he resigned in protest. And Fred Hoff has written a number of times that under the Obama administration, the United States did not save one single civilian life in Syria. And that's hardly much of a human rights policy. Yes?
Hi, I'm Deborah Weiss with Front Page Magazine. And I realize that there are a lot of people who identify themselves as Muslim who eschew the violent aspects of Islam and maybe some of the anti-freedom aspects. But given the fact that the Islamists, as you're calling them, have the Quran, hundreds of years of Islamic jurisprudence, and Muhammad as the exemplary man as their source, how would you suggest that moderates have better ideas? If your argument is realism, how realistic is that?
Well, I think it's realistic. I mean, it's worth saying, of course, this fight within Islam is in a certain sense not our fight. I mean, you know, I worked for George W. Bush, and he said a number of times, Islam is a religion of peace. And I always thought, you should not say that. You are not a theologian. First of all, you're not a Muslim. Second, you're not a theologian. So on what basis do we say what Islam, on what basis does any American president say what Islam is or isn't? It's not for us. But the fight has been fought successfully in a number of places. Start with Tunisia, which admittedly is tiny. And it has certain advantages. It's close to Europe. It is homogeneous. You know, there's no Sunni Shia fight. Everybody's a Sunni. Over the decades, women have really been able to participate in the economy quite successfully. So it's not typical, but it is true that a Muslim Brotherhood party won the first election and then started losing. I think this, you know, a better example is Indonesia, which is the most populous Muslim country in the world, where movements developed. The NU party under former President Wahid was a moderate party. that said this kind of extremist stuff is wrong and it is untrue to Islam. And there are people making that argument. In Egypt, at Al-Azhar, people are making this argument. I think the Saudis are substantially to blame over the recent decades for Saudis are to blame over recent decades for propagating an extreme form of Islam, which they were able to do because after 73, they had a lot of money. Now, the Crown Prince has talked quite differently recently and talked about moderation being central to Islam. It would be great for Muslims, but I would say for us in the West, if he carries through on that, because there have been decades where the Saudis were paying for quite extreme imams, madrasas, mosques. And it's interesting because there are a number of cases where people refused. Morocco has never allowed the Saudis to do that. The King of Morocco has always said, no thanks. We'll train our own imams. And actually, they're now doing something even more important. Morocco is now training imams from all over Muslim countries in sub-Saharan Africa in a moderate form of Islam. So in a certain sense, you know, we will suffer if this debate goes wrong, but it's not our debate. And I do think there are, I think it's clear there are resources in Islam that people who want to make the argument for moderation can use, and there are examples of where they've done it, and they've done it successfully. Yes?
I'm sorry, I'm an independent activist. I remember in 1983, in a hearing in House, you were one of the witnesses. At the time, I forgot, he's dead now, that was the chairman. And you were talking about regarding opposition in El Salvador and those Central America issues. Right now, you are talking about the Muslim. My question is that, do you have what is the definitions of your human rights that doesn't change because of one government or other, whether it's US or Soviet Union or Russia or any? Do you have such a definition?
Yeah, I don't, thank you for having a long memory, going back to 83. It might have been Henry Hyde, who was chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I don't think this is a huge problem. First of all, there are some international agreements that everybody has signed. Everybody has signed. There's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So what do we mean, actually? We mean liberty under law. We do not mean majoritarianism, period. Whatever 51% or 50% plus one want, it's it. We believe in constitutions. We believe in limits on government. We believe in an independent judiciary. We believe in freedom of speech, press, assembly. We believe in free elections as the way to choose governments. I mean, those are the essentials. And I think that they are the essentials in every country. That leaves you a lot of leeway. Japan's democracy is awfully different. Japan's politics are awfully different from ours. They have an emperor, they have a unicameral legislature. Politics quite different from ours, but it's a democracy. It's clearly a democracy. And democracy is, I think, quite adaptable to a lot of different cultures around the world. There is a long argument, Reagan used to talk about this. Democracy is basically only for people along the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. It's for us. It's not for, people after World War II said the Japanese will never have a democracy. It's impossible. You don't understand their culture. And the emperor and all that's impossible. Asians will never be able to have democracy. It's this Confucian culture, you see. I remember this in the 80s in Latin America. People said, you don't understand. It's the combination of Spanish colonialism and the Catholic Church. They'll never be able to be. Well, this is all wrong. I mean, it's been proved wrong. Sustaining democracy is very difficult all over the world. We've seen in Europe, for example, some cases of where people have seemed to move back. We've certainly seen it in Latin America. Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela. So I'm not arguing that it is easy to sustain. It's not. But I think the cultural argument that it's impossible here or there is not right. And I think that we do have these common definitions that work across cultures. As let me just say, as Condi Rice used to say, nobody, but nobody, wants a system in which the secret police can come to your house at midnight and drag your son or daughter off to a prison.
I have a follow-up.
Okay, one follow-up, because there are others.
With regard to your notion of human rights, when I said yours, I mean whatever you represent, how do you implement that human rights to operation of Israel, whether in Palestine, inside, or in this country, or other countries?
We're talking about two things. First, Israel. Second, the West Bank. Israel is a democracy by any, full democracy by any definition. The Palestinian Authority areas are not. First of all, the Israeli army has significant residual powers. The Palestinian Authority itself is not a democracy. They haven't had an election in 11 years. Everybody in office there was elected for a 4 or 5 year term that ended, 10 years ago. So, nor is there freedom of speech or freedom of press in the Palestinian areas. And Palestinian police, unfortunately, are used by the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah party, to pressure people who might criticize or are criticizing the government. I don't think that's inevitable, nor do I think it's caused by the Israelis. I think Palestinian democracy has risen and fallen. Obviously, it was worst under Arafat. And I think it's very unfortunate that the PA authorities now, the Fatah authorities, and the Hamas authorities in Gaza seem actually uninterested in democracy. Yes?
Thank you. My name is Cynthia Huger. I lived in Saudi, Riyadh, for a year. Very unusual, but I'd like to ask your comments about the Crown Prince has now put a number of royal members under house arrest. And what do you think is the underlying reason for that? And then I have a second question. The second question is, could you comment a little bit about now that Jerusalem is? Thank you.
Well, I think Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, has a gigantic task ahead of him. That's clear if he's trying to modernize Saudi Arabia. And he takes the view that this is going to need a further centralization of power. It's hard enough, and if you don't agree with what I'm doing, be quiet. I mean, so I think what you're seeing here, you're going to see, you're going to see significant economic liberalization. I think you're going to see social liberalization. You're not going to see political liberalization, because his view, seems it to be, I can't afford it now. I can't afford it. I need to bring all this power together in the government to achieve what I need to achieve over the next, Saudi 2030, so 13 years. So he's making it very clear with these arrests. I will not tolerate dissent on these matters. Get on board. And it's clear, I mean, I was going to say it's undemocratic. Well, it's an absolute monarchy, so of course it's undemocratic. And people are being offered the opportunity to pay to, in a sense, wash their sins away. And obviously, this is a system that Americans would never want to live by. And I don't know whether it's going to work because, you know, you would have to assume that people who are told, give us $500 million and shut up, are not happy about it and may not be loyal to him. But that's, I think, that is what he's doing. I think he's centralizing political power because he believes he needs it to do everything else he needs to do. Jerusalem, I have had the opportunity to write a few pieces in the last couple of days. I'm fully supportive of what the president did. First, because he said something that's true. He said Jerusalem's the capital of Israel. Well, it is the capital of Israel. I was talking with Hella just before we started. There's a famous incident in 2016, I think, with President Obama. The president of Israel, Shimon Peres, dies, so he goes to Israel, Obama, and he lays a wreath at the gravesite of Shimon Peres, whom he admired. And so the White House issues the photo of Obama laying the wreath, and it says, you know, President Obama lays wreath at the gravesite of Shimon Peres in Mount Herzl Cemetery, Jerusalem, Israel. Up! You're not allowed to say that. So they reissued the photo about an hour later, literally the case, with the word Israel lined through. Lined through. It was still there with a line through it. And I remember asking at the time, I wrote a blog post at the time saying, in what country does, in what city and what country does Barack Obama think Shimon Peres is buried? Does he think he's buried on the moon? In what country is Rabin buried? In what country, for that matter, is Herzl buried? There is actually a country there. It's called Israel. So this is a first. It's just saying, come on, you know, a whole bunch of American presidents and Secretary of States have visited there. Why do they go there? They go there to see Israeli officials because it's the capital of Israel. Second, I think there's one country on the face of the earth whose selection of a capital is refused legitimacy. One, only Israel. So I think it's part of the general delegitimization of Israel, the refusal to acknowledge it's here, it's permanent, it's legitimate. And the president is saying, I don't want any part of that. So I think it's about time. I wish it had happened sooner. It's been 70 years, close, 69 actually. The argument is then made, yeah, fine, but it's too dangerous. You're destroying the chances for peace. I mean, if you read, the Swedish foreign minister called it catastrophic. By the way, if you're not sure you're supportive of what the president did, the Swedish foreign minister called it catastrophic. Now you know he was right. Why is it catastrophic? To say something that's quite obvious and factual. I think some of these things were threats of violence. When people, quote, predict 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 days ago, if the president goes through with this, there's going to be rioting, there might be terrorism, they're not exactly predicting, they're kind of promising and threatening. And if you back off in the face of that, you, Donald Trump, and you say, oh, well, okay, then you're going to get more of it because people will have found, oh, now we know you threaten violence, and Trump will say, oh, I don't want any violence. In fact, what the president did was to say, I'm doing what's right, and it is your job in the governments of all these countries to keep law and order, to prevent terrorism, to prevent violence. Now look what happened in the Palestinian Authority today. They closed the schools. And what's the point of closing the schools? So that all the students can go out and demonstrate. And we're not talking about 5-year-old kids here. We're also talking about high school kids. 16, 17, 18. Is that likely to promote violence? Yes. So they're not doing their job. They're in fact fueling the possibility of violence. And I don't think any president should back off when threatened in that way. One more comment on this. I worked for George W. Bush. So in 2004, he had a famous exchange of letters with Ariel Sharon. And in those letters, Bush said, look, there's no so-called right of return where every Palestinian refugee and that person's children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren can move to anywhere in Israel they want. Not happening. And for the major settlement blocks, obviously they're going to be part of Israel. That's what Bush said. A friend of mine just emailed me a statement from 54 very distinguished American diplomats, high-ranking American diplomats, saying this is a catastrophe. This is the end of peace talks. Well, it wasn't. And Bush was, as he described it, he made that statement and then he went to a G7 summit, and I remember him saying, I was the skunk at the garden party. It wasn't the end of the world, and it wasn't the end of negotiations. There were plenty of negotiations after that. They didn't get anywhere. But the notion that, the peace process is over, just not true. So, and I don't think it's true here. I will make one prediction. In addition to what we're seeing today, all the denunciations and demonstrations, Vice President Pence is going to Israel in, 10 days, something like that, this month. And I believe was scheduled to see President Abbas. And I bet you that Abbas will cancel that as a show of outrage. But when it's in their interest to come back to the table, whether that's January or July or whatever it is, they'll do it. How are we doing? You have a few more minutes? Sir. Oh, wait a minute. You had a question. Okay, no, but you already had one, right? So I got to try somebody new first. Yes.
Thank you. Ted Voorhees, Covington and Berlin. I hope this isn't asking you just to repeat what you just said, but it relates to what does the peace process mean? How should we be thinking about that right now? Everyone is saying, oh, this will hurt the peace process. But a cynic could say, well, look, I've look back to 1948. What is the peace process? There is no peace process. So how would you define the peace? Is the peace process something that actually is aimed at something, or is it simply a method for maintaining low levels of violence?
Well, there is a peace process. There's just no peace. I wouldn't be quite that cynical about it. I mean, certainly there was no peace process at all. One has to remember in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, after the 73 war, the Arab League met and everybody said, no one talks to Israel, no one negotiates, nothing. So it's a relatively new thing, last 20 years. And it has failed. And I would say it has failed because the Palestinians were not ready for any compromises. At Camp David under President Clinton, Prime Minister Barak and Clinton made some offers to Arafat, which he turned down. 2000, 8 years later, Prime Minister Olmert of Israel made better offers to President Abbas, and he walked away from that. Obama tried very hard with Abbas, and he walked away again. So, I do think that on the Jerusalem point, the notion that, this will kill the peace process is a little bit silly. Basically, for 8 years of the Obama period, there were no peace negotiations. There were no serious negotiations, and there haven't really been any for a long time. I'm not skeptical or cynical, but I am pessimistic about the so-called peace process, because I don't think President Abbas is going to sign anything. I'm not against, that doesn't mean I'm against negotiations. You're never going to find out unless you try. But I do think, he's 82. He's not a charismatic leader. He's no longer a legitimate leader because he was last elected in 2005 and has not been willing to hold another election. He's not going to take these big risks of signing a deal with the Israelis, which is necessarily a compromise. Hamas, we know, whatever the terms are, we know what Hamas is going to say. Traitor, Arafat wouldn't sign, you signed. He's not going to do that, I think. So my advice to the administration has been, you can do a lot of good. You can do a lot of pragmatic things. Maybe there are ways of helping the Palestinian economy, the Palestinian people. But if you think you're going to get a final comprehensive peace deal. I personally just don't think that's in the cards right now. Yes.
Hi, my name is Paul Schwa. I'm a lowly intern here at Heritage.
Is that an actual title, lowly intern?
Yeah. No, it's
We have that title.
I've given it to myself. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on the, I guess, final outcome or lesson to be learned from the Arab Spring regarding realism versus democracy, or whether the Arab Spring teaches anything about kind of putting democracy, I guess I'll leave the question at that.
Well, though it has been a few years, it's still, in a sense, early. Tunisia, for example, is an experiment. 10 years from now, will it be a dictatorship again, or will we say, no, this is a real model of kind of stable democracy? Will Jordan and Morocco have kings, but they also have elections, parliaments, will they have moved slightly in the direction of constitutional monarchy or away from it? So it's early, the famous remark about maybe legendary conversation between Kissinger and Zhou Enlai in the 70s, and Kissinger asks him about the French Revolution, and Zhou Enlai says, too soon to tell. So it is pretty soon. What are the lessons? I'll give you one lesson that I think we keep forgetting. I go back to this question of chaos. Chaos, which was connected with World War I, is how the Bolsheviks took power. The collapse of the security of the Tsar's army, the collapse of the army, Cuba, 59, the collapse of the Shah's army, Iran, 79, collapse of the Iraqi army under us, which led to massive disorder, chaos, violence, versus, let's say, the Reagan cases. It did not happen in South Korea. It did not happen in the Philippines. It did not happen in Chile. And because we knew what we were doing. I mean, we knew that chaos is the enemy of moderation. Chaos is the enemy of human rights and democracy. And I think that's one thing that we should think about in the Middle Eastern cases. You do not want overnight collapses that lead to chaos. I mean, what saved Egypt from the Brotherhood was the army, the fact that the army was still there. And the people of Egypt had a rescue opportunity, in a sense, with the army. This is one reason I think in some of these cases, the monarchies may actually get to democracy first, because the king or sheikh, whatever the title is, is in the system, but also above the system, and is always commander-in-chief. So if things start going wrong, you have a rescue possibility. So I think that's one lesson. The other lesson I'd say is the one I said earlier. Policemen aren't going to win the debate with the Islamists. Somebody's got to debate them. Somebody's got to defeat them politically. Somebody's got to persuade Arabs these are really bad ideas, and these are heretical ideas, and you will be sorry if you vote this way. We have better ideas. It can't be the United States. It's got to be moderate and sensible forces in those countries. How are we doing? Last one, or are we?
Could I take
Yep.
the privilege of asking you a follow-up
Okay.
question? If you think about yourself and your point of view, say 10, 15, maybe 15 years ago, would you have said the same thing? Or how far have you come philosophically from watching and participating in all these events?
Well, I would have said that, certainly I would have said that the promotion of democracy and respect for human rights is important for the United States. I mean, I worked on that under President Reagan. So the idea that this should be part of American foreign policy is not new. What's new to me is the work on the Middle East, which actually came in the Bush years. So I didn't know much about the Middle East. I had been there, but not, I've been there many, many times now. And that first lesson that I just mentioned, I don't think I was quite aware of. And it's only in the context of the Arab cases that it has become so clear to me, and partly Iraq and our own unhappy experience, that it's become clearer to me that this question of order versus chaos is very closely linked to the question of whether you can protect democracy and human rights.
Do you see any parallels at all with Europe in the 19th century and the Enlightened monarchies making way for democratic?
Well, I mean, one thing that you see is that it takes a lot of time, and that revolutionary situations don't tend to lead to democracy, whether it's the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, that this is a slow and painful process, even in Europe. And it's going to be, I mean, if you just think of the Arab world for a minute, well, just think of the collapse of the Soviet Union. You have all these states in Eastern and Central Europe. They had real advantages. Some of them had been democracies, the Czechs, for example. They had, in the interwar period, they had experience with democracy. They also had a model and a magnet in the EU. What do we in Hungary, Poland, Romania, what do we want to be like? Oh, we want to be like the French and the Germans and the Dutch and the Danes and this, meaning economies that are growing and human rights. And the EU was saying, you can't join unless you make human rights progress. And NATO was saying, you can't join unless you make this progress. So we were kind of shaping them up. And they knew what the goal was. The Arab League is not providing that kind of model and magnet in the Arab world. So, and there is no lived experience of democracy. So there's no question it's going to be harder. President Bush used to say it's the work of generations. And people dismiss that line. But that's real. In other words, nobody's going to become a stable democracy in 2 or 3 years. It is the work of generations. And there will be setbacks along the way. But I do think that for the reasons I've noted, if we really want to defeat, and we must, Islamist extremism, respect for human rights and democracy are part of the answer. Thank you very much for being here today.